Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar, Managing a Shared Space During COVID-19. My name is Lexi Paza, and I'm the Senior Manager of Real Estate and Operations at Tides, as well as the Co-Director of NCN. I'm joined today by a few other hosts, David Schrayer, Director of Real Estate and Operations at Tides, and also Co-Director of NCN, and Saul Ettlin, Director of Consulting at Community Vision and Steering Committee of NCN. And of course, we are led by Lena Waite, Consulting Coordinator NCN, who is going to manage all of the technology and keep us going today. So thanks for Lena, to Lena for all of her work on making this happen. I want to preface this call by saying that this is a really unprecedented moment for the world and our community of nonprofit centers. We know as operators of shared space ourselves, and hearing from so many of you in the past few weeks, that there are myriad challenges of supporting a tenant community, sustaining your own organization, managing empty physical assets, or for some centers being a real epicenter of the community response to COVID-19 if you're a direct service or community health center. This call is not our typical model for NCN. Usually we have much smaller calls. They're typically called Ask NCN Live. They include some sort of community discussion and prepared slides, but knowing how disrupted the network is and will continue to be, we decided to disrupt our own model and plan this call in just a few days. It was made available to all of you, both members of NCN as well as non-members at no charge. And we do appreciate your patience with the format, kind of given these circumstances. A few logistics, we will be recording this session, but given that it's done through Zoom webinar, we won't get to see, unfortunately, any of your faces, and your names will only appear in the chat will only appear in the recording if you identify yourself in the chat. Speaking of chat, we'll be taking questions in the chat box throughout the session. This is designed to be participatory through the chat, even if we can't hear your voices or see your faces. If your questions that you submit are relevant to the topic being discussed at that moment, Lena from NCN will do her best to integrate those questions into the segments with that speaker. If we run out of time during a specific segment, we're going to try to keep ourselves on track. We have a lot of information to get through. If we run out of time for your question, or the question is unrelated to what's currently being discussed, which is totally fine, we'll actually put it in a parking lot and address it at the end. If you feel like Lena missed your question, it's possible because the chat we hope is going to be flowing through the whole during the whole call. If you feel like she missed your question, feel free just to resubmit so it ends up back in the window. We also want this to be participatory in that you can answer each other's questions in the chat. We certainly don't have all of the examples of things that people are doing to weather this crisis. And so if someone asks a question that you have an idea from your center, or you've seen a best practice already emerge, feel free to add that into the chat and support each other through that. Saul and David and Lane and I, we have been a part of this world for a while, but you know, we recognize our own limitations and welcome all of your input as well. We really did want this to be in a format where everyone could see one another's faces, given how important that kind of connection is right now. But the level of attendance that we're really grateful for has made that a slightly messy option. Accordingly, we encourage you, if you're comfortable, to introduce yourself and where you're coming from in the chat so that others can see who else is on the line. One last thing, we'll be running 2 polls during this webinar to collect more information about your pain points, including one popping up in a minute or two. It'd be really great if you'd participate in these. We know that we can't even get close to covering enough about the impacts of COVID-19 on your center, especially because the news and our landscape changes sometimes hourly, but definitely daily. So we're going to explore doing more specialized sessions with additional experts in the field if the demand is there. So your participation in those polls will help us get to a place where maybe we can pull in additional experts to address other questions that we didn't get to today. That's it for logistics, Lena, unless I missed anything. Perfect. So we're going to kick this off first to Saul Ettlin, again, Director of Consulting at Community Vision and Steering Committee member at NCN.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking the time this morning to join us. This is definitely different than our traditional Ask NCN where we can see all of each other. Looking forward to hearing questions as we move forward. So the section I have is around center sustainability. So we're focusing mostly on revenue and expense in this section. I'm going to touch on a few items that we've been thinking about in our work at Community Vision. We work with nonprofits on the tenant side around securing space. And so we've been thinking a lot about how are they going to interact with their landlords. And as many centers have tenants, hopefully all of them do, that this is probably coming up in your organizations. I think, something to keep in mind, most centers have been created to provide affordable, stabilized rent to their organizations. And for the centers that have the flexibility to do that, should stay the course around supporting their organizations at a time where their expenses have tightened, and they can definitely use the flexibility for the cash that they may have on hand towards other uses. We also recognize that not all centers are facing challenges around their tenants who are not able to use space, but that some of the centers are on the front line of this work, especially our health centers that are open and active, maybe a testing place, maybe seeing patients. And that's a different set of questions that we're not necessarily expert to answer today, but we would certainly happy to touch on. I think the kind of the first thing I would imagine many centers are thinking about, especially we'd imagine that there's a degree of flexibility for centers depending on what your ownership structure looks like right now. If you're a center that owns your building outright and has no debt, we would imagine that you're able to be much more flexible in how you're able to respond to your tenants. For our centers that own their building but have debt, those are, as you have cash obligations to someone else, the revenue that you're may be losing because your tenants aren't able to pay is probably a concern for you. We would certainly recommend that you reach out to your lender as soon as possible to discuss what terms you have for either some kind of pause on payments, either whether it's interest or principal, and if you're able to extend the length of your loan and have those payments come out on the back end so that at least for the next 60, 90, 120 days that you have some flexibility to work with your tenants. For our centers that lease their space from a landlord and then are releasing space is probably one of the most challenging spaces to be in. And of course you should be, hopefully you have a very positive and open relationship with your landlord. And we very much encourage you to, if you have not spoken to your landlord yet, that you should be speaking with the building ownership to discuss, again, similar kinds of terms that you may speak with a lender. Is there some way to do rent abatement? Can we extend our lease by 3 months and maybe not pay rent in the upfront, or have a reduced rent while you're not receiving income from your tenants? And this is probably also true for our co-working facilities. And across the board, everyone has, if your center is significantly relying on event rental revenue, this is going to impact your revenue side. And I think you should be explaining to any other folks that you have an obligation to what your situation is, so you can, sorry, I'm just pulling back up my notes here. So that they can understand where you're at financially. I think when it comes to lenders, I think, and owners, I think they're going to be interested in hearing what your ongoing sustainability plan is. So how are you moving through this moment? What's the resiliency of your center if they make this investment into your organization to do some kind of deferment, whether that's rent payments or loan payments? What is your center plan to come out on the other side? So thinking about that on your tenant side, the same is true thinking about your relationship with your tenants. Are you in a position to provide any kind of deferral of rent or rent abatement? you can look at extending leases on the back end, 3 months of reduced rent or no rent, maybe the tenant then agrees to extend their lease for 3-6 months on the backside. You would also want to be interested in understanding their financial position, assessing need, and assessing ongoing sustainability of the organization. Your ability to provide a rent abatement will be key to them, to your tenant organizations doing their financial modeling to figure out what their sustainability is in the long run. Community Vision runs a website called spacesforgood.org. Maybe Lena, you could put that in the chat box. Spacesforgood.org. We have downloadable tools. So if you have a tenant organization, we find this often with smaller organizations, they don't have the tools to do scenario planning. We have put up a couple of tools. One is a kind of a revenue risk calculator, so it takes them through a process, and then a scenario planner. So if you're having tenants that are trying to figure out what their cash position is, what's their way forward, I would encourage you to pull down, you can point your tenants to that website to pull down those tools. I think everybody should be looking at all of your current agreements. So whether that's a lease agreement or in your insurance documents, looking at, my guess is this is going to be pretty rare, but it's worth looking at your act of God clauses and or force majeure clauses to see if on the off chance pandemic allows you for some flexibility within that agreement. If you're lucky enough to have business interruption insurance, that's a rider. Some business interruption insurance does include global pandemic to be able to access funds under your insurance clauses or your insurance policy. Talking with funders, it'd be interesting to hear what other folks think. I would imagine there's an opportunity here, particularly for theme centers, for health centers, to go to funders to talk about what's happening at your center, how your center is responding to the moment, and that an investment in your center is in turn an investment in a large group of organizations. And I think we would encourage you to reach out to your key funders, let them know what's going on with your center and how they can help. I think with that, that kind of covers our high level sort of key bullet points. And I want to kind of shift now to taking just direct questions from folks around revenue, on revenue considerations for your center. And we could take some, I didn't really touch on much on the expense side, but we could certainly open that up, except for rent, if you have to pay rent or a mortgage. Can I ask if anybody has sort of taken any of these actions so far? Has anyone talked to a landlord or talked to a lender, and what was the outcome of that conversation? Or could folks share with us if you're already having tenants ask for rent abatement or reductions in rent? Great, I'm seeing interest rate on our mortgage by 1.5%, or sorry, 1.75%. Talked to landlord, nothing was offered. You should, again, review your lease for what happens in events like this. You may want to talk to real estate counsel for some guidance. I think sort of offering landlords something, right? So it's a give, get, and understanding that they may be in a debt situation themselves and are trying to figure out what their cash flow looks like. And Lena, I think, will we be taking, I think we could probably, if we get a lot of responses, we can summarize these and send them out as a follow-up with some responses, with some key questions as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
great. Thank you.
I just closed the poll at the start there.
Can you share the results?
Oh,
Or did
yes.
it,
Yes, I can.
that's great.
Right now? Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it.
Oh, share results. There we go. This is a new technological aspect for me. Is that showing?
Not yet. Try it again. I think this is the side that might have been like glitchy.
It says attendees are now viewing the poll results. Okay.
Did the poll go up? I don't.
Yeah, but maybe not to panelists.
Oh, there we go. I see.
All right.
Hopefully everybody can see that. I've got it.
There is a question, Saul. Do you have recommendations for how various disaster loan grant relief programs might apply?
Yeah. I haven't seen anything specifically around, debt. I think everybody's like today, PPP opened. I think if your center is open and you're able to keep your staff, you are likely eligible for the payroll protection program. David or Lexi, have you seen anything else on the real estate side for programming?
No, I haven't seen anything other than the SBA stuff. A note on that, I mean, I would encourage tenants to apply for those, anything that's available as quickly as possible, under the assumption that those funds are gonna run out. So taking advantage of whatever you see, applying for it just so you're in the queue, and then see what happens.
I think more what we're seeing is, in the Bay Area, what we're seeing is a lot of programs directed to specific subsectors, arts grant funds, arts loan funds, other kinds of grant funds. I think, as much as your center can be a touch point for your tenants in assembling those grant opportunities that most of them are quite local or regional. So if there's somebody on your staff that has the time to cull those opportunities and put them in a place for your tenants and for your broader community, nonprofit community, that's a real asset. I think people are, there's so much flying around right now, both on the what are the next 3 steps I should take as an organization to, long lists of actions that you can take. I think if as centers, for the centers particularly that sees them as capacity builders for their tenant community, highly recommend, if you can get onto your center website or on your center internal communication, the grant opportunities. If you have an internal listserv, and maybe Lexi will talk about this more in her center community section, but starting that conversation, what are other tenants seeing as grant opportunities so they can share with each other what's going on in their community. Lena, did you see the request to show the poll results again?
Yes, I was trying to see if I could do a quick image, but let's see. Is that showing? Or do I have to share it twice for it to work?
I think you have to share it twice for some reason. I think this is the goofy thing.
You share, then you stop, and then you share again.
I know. Yay,
for those of you who want to do this on your own with your centers.
And Saul, if I can chime in really quickly, I wanted to share just a few ideas that as David and I were exploring rent abatement, deferral, other flexibility we might be able to extend to tenants. And this is just through internet research, but to save all of you, if you haven't Googled this yet, some of the options that came up with were rent deferral, and then the deferred amounts can be paid over the remaining term of the lease. So for example, allowing April rent to be deferred and then needs to be paid either in full or in partial payments by October 1st or some date that you set. Reducing rent payments to cover only landlord's expenses, so like CAM and finance charges. So what are the ways that you can still cover your basic expenses while still extending a level of flexibility to your tenants? And another option was allowing tenants the option to draw down on any of their security deposits in order to offset monthly rent, with the understanding then that the tenants would replenish the security deposit at some point in the future.
Great. I wanted to answer the question around scenario planning. I think this is a framework that if you were to use, there's a couple other folks who have the scenario planning tool. I think NFF has one on their website. I think FMA's got one available. Really the scenario planning, so you kind of figure out, this is at an organizational level, figuring out your cash position, and then sort of, I would highly recommend doing the revenue risk calculator, sort of what funds are you going to still have coming in, so that you can then look at what kind of staffing structures that you're able to maintain moving forward. Really, it's kind of a high, medium, high, low kind of scenario. I think this really builds a case especially for your tenant organizations, to talk to their funders. It's sort of like, if I raise this much in grant funds through the COVID crisis, that we're going to be able to maintain this level of service or provide these arts and culture programs to the community. Here's our strategy to do that. Really, both it's so that the board and the leadership staff in the organization really have a framework to make decisions about how they're moving forward, and then secondarily to make a case to funders and supporters around, if we're able to, we need this to maintain this level.
Yeah, I would also caution that any changes to how you're collecting rent or deferring it should all be done via lease amendments if you have leases in place. That's one of the issues that came up when we were investigating that issue. And it relates to, I saw one question came up on the impact of an abatement on a tenant's eligibility for any of the SBA loan products. So that's a reason that you might do a deferral rather than an abatement. And you can always abate it later, but for the time being, you're showing that as an accrued expense for the tenant. So it's not going to impact their SBA eligibility.
Great.
So I think given our time, maybe we'll move on to Lexi's part. Thank you, Saul.
Oh, David.
Oh, sorry, David.
Yep.
I got out of order.
Right.
No, fine.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. My name is David Schrayer. I'm the Director of Real Estate and Operations at Tides and recent NCN co-director. I'm going to touch a little bit on some of the simple logistics issues that have come up. And a lot of these things have already been addressed in the on the listserv. So the first of those is mail, and this is something that we all struggle with. Tides has a foundation, so we receive and distribute a huge number of checks, and so this is a big concern for us. So right now we're staffing minimally to process those checks as they come in, and correspondence as well. So we have essentially one staff person that's doing that on a daily basis, or 4 days a week now. But I would encourage that wherever possible, mail can just be forwarded. So again, if we're focused on taking care of people and creating social distance, in as much as it's possible, it's a pretty simple process and you can do it online, to get the mail forwarded to somewhere that someone can deal with it. This is going to be on a case-by-case basis. Obviously, everyone has their own circumstances. We've also started the process of switching over to a lockbox system, so that all of our correspondence is going to be opened by a third party off-site. The checks will get deposited straight into our bank account, and then the mail all the correspondence is scanned and then sent to someone for distribution. So if you're thinking about a 2 or 3 month outlook where these social distancing measures are in effect, that's something that you should consider. We organize that through our commercial bank, so that might be a resource if people are interested. That might be a resource that that people could use. We saw in one case where a building was closed. This was at New Path. They just created an outside mailbox so that the mail could continue to be delivered, and then people were sorting that on a limited basis. Again, I mean, the goal is always to maintain the social distancing. So as much as possible, have people come to the building at different times. So creating a schedule around that is important. That's something we did internally, so that the checks were being opened one day, and then the next day the accounts payable person or accounts receivable person was coming in to actually handle the checks. That has to also do with kind of general security concerns. I know that's been a big issue for people depending on the location of your center. So we're trying to leverage our outside vendors, many of whom are still coming to the building. So we have security daily that's still on site. Because they're considered in San Francisco, they're considered essential staff, so they're allowed to still come on site. And then we have alternating staff coming in, again, to create and maintain the social distancing, so that we kind of always have eyes on the building at different times. We have janitorial staff at night, so we have that view as well. If there are specific concerns, you should for sure reach out to local police department. And everyone's kind of in the same boat now, but if you have specific concerns, you can definitely talk to the local, essentially the beat cop, who will, and they'll keep a special eye out. So having that kind of relationship with local law enforcement can be very useful. There were some questions I saw on the listserv about security cameras. So if you don't have a system like that in place, I think that creating a small, essentially a residential, security system is a fairly easy lift, and for a couple $100 is maybe a good investment, so that you have that at your disposal, even if it's just front door or entrance doors, so that you can see who's coming in and out of the building, and obviously if there's a break-in, there's a record of that. On maintenance issues, I mean, we're really trying to keep on top of all of our maintenance concerns. So all of our preventative maintenance. I believe in most jurisdictions, even in New York, which has a pretty draconian order in place, we're allowed to maintain those activities. So we're for sure doing that. There was a question about switch over of HVAC systems from winter to summer, and that's a really critical time to take care of what's a very expensive, in most cases, very expensive system in your building. So absolutely that work should be done, and then work with your preventative maintenance contractor to get the right settings in place. So maybe you're not, cooling the building to the way that you would normally, but it still has to, the system should still be set up to operate according to the outside temperature. What else? So we have less people in the building, so we have less need for janitorial services. So we're on a 1 day a week schedule in both of our campuses for that. We feel the janitors can do a especially deep clean and disinfecting during that time. And again, the tenants know when that work is going to happen, and so they can act accordingly. We have taken the approach that we're going to continue to pay our vendors through this, at least for as long as we can. So we're trying to sort of hold them close and understand that in some cases they're, you know, the more vulnerable people that could be affected by this, and so we're trying to do our part to make sure that they can still sustain themselves. So I think that that's critical that, you know, people think about that in a personal way. Yeah, I think that's mostly what I wanted to touch on. Any specific questions around logistics?
David, how much is that that offsite sorting for someone for a center that might be considering that option?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. But again, I think it's fairly common, and I know that our property managers use those lockbox systems already. I'm sure it's volume based, but yeah, and again, I think you could get a quick answer to that by talking to your commercial banker.
I'm curious about some of the costs that, David, you might not be able to answer this, but from those of you chiming in around different camera systems that you're using, if that's something people just installed in light of this or have had in place for some time, is there kind of a cheaper option to quickly set up?
Yeah, I'm seeing the blink cameras. That's very popular. Yeah, and that's really, you know, that's all you need. I mean, you know, you can spend $100,000 on a security camera system, but who wants to do that?
And David, there was a question that came in. What company should we be reaching out to for deep cleaning services? Can it be regular janitorial services or hazmat?
Yeah, I mean, my personal view on this is that these deep cleaning, essentially post-disaster, post-serious contamination cleanings are not necessary. That the normal disinfecting that any janitorial staff is capable of doing, and it doesn't have to be alcohol or bleach. It's just disinfectants. I mean, if you look on the CDC site, those are the recommendations that they have. So I think there's some gouging going on around this, and some people will only feel good if they're doing a so-called deep cleaning. But my view is that that's not necessarily, and that normal disinfecting it should be thorough, but by your normal janitorial staff is more than sufficient.
I'm seeing this recommendation to hold off the guest Wi-Fi as a cost-cutting measure, which I think is great. Can others post in sort of, you know, less painful, you know, pre-staff kind of cost-cutting measures that they've taken to that others might want to consider?
And just a reminder, so everyone can see that, just select that to field for all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, just the panelists will send it, or we'll see it. Thanks.
And then David and Lexi will just talk about it amongst ourselves later. Get share it.
Because we have nothing else to do.
I wanted to highlight another piece, a sort of unexpected piece that came up for us at Tides was watering plants. We went the shelter-in-place order. It felt like it all happened really quickly, and some staff members were already in a work from home, and some tenants were already working from home when that order went into place, and so they couldn't return to the office to get their plants, or their plants were too big to take home. And that was a concern for folks, right? Like and we didn't want them to show back up to the office and all of their beloved plants were dead. And so if there is an essential person coming on site to do a few things, it might be worth asking if there are plants that need to be watered. Of course, this isn't the highest level need, But if it can be done, it would be a favor to folks, and asking your tenants, even if it involves, going into their office and unlocking their doors and checking on their plants, and just making sure there's nothing else that needs kind of a weekly maintenance piece was ended up, I think, was a good payoff for us. People felt well taken care of.
There's just another comment here about our waste haulers reduced our monthly fees by half by reducing pickups during the lockdown. Because I don't think that came out to everyone.
I will, if there are, I think the chat is still going regarding maybe low-hanging fruit around cost savings. I'll go ahead and move into the maintaining community to keep us on track, and then we can get to questions that have popped up after that. Hopefully we still have a few more minutes. So the portion that I'll cover is the concept of maintaining community in a way that so many of us have gone fully virtual. Again, we understand that there are differences, different municipalities. Our Canadian centers, we're not experts on right now what your access looks like for your community members or your staff. And we also recognize that some community health centers are probably not moving fully virtual, rather they're handling much higher traffic for in their spaces. This is really for centers who are finding that they once offered workspace and now are really trying to take their community online. I think first I want to highlight that it's natural right now to be prioritizing the sharing of information regarding access, safety, and financial obligations. I think it's really natural for those things to take precedent. Tenants and members are probably looking to you as a source of information around financial assistance programs for nonprofits and small businesses, other relief resources. So I think it's okay if your communication out to your tenants feels more business-like, even sending out a list of links that they can find out more information on the NCN listserv that David mentioned earlier. For those of you who are members, hopefully you're receiving these messages as they send out. The same information can be forwarded right on to your members so that they, so you've already done the work of compiling these resources for them. This might be especially helpful if your own organization is larger than a lot of the member organizations or tenant organizations. You might simply have more staff capacity to be reading these rules, digesting these regulations, and crafting recommendations in real time, whether it's around safety or business continuity. So it's worth considering if maybe part of your value add to your community at this point is sharing your organization's own communications with permission, of course, with your HR or whoever's developing these. But maybe it's to the service of your members to share those out. Irene from Sketchpad highlighted that when considering what and how you're engaging virtually with your community, the key is to continue offering value. It's possible that the value that you're able to deliver is simply ensuring that your tenants and members are receiving critical information from your city or county or state and have a place to process it with you, whether it's just you or whether they can process it with other community members. I mean, that is, kind of the power of this community that existed in a physical space and now exists for this level of support. We would strongly recommend exploring options for two-way communications within your community that aren't simply mass emails. And we'd recommend utilizing a platform that doesn't need to be over-managed by you or your team. As all of you understand and know, mass emails, the sender bears the brunt of all of the out-of-office messages, undeliverable kickbacks. The formatting can be a real bear after 2 or 3 forwards or iterations. And it tends to be hard to track where conversations started or where resources are being shared. So if you don't already have the collaborative infrastructure in place, this is a great time to do it. Listservs are essentially basic electronic mailing lists where members send an email to a single address and then the message blasts out to all of the subscribers. NCN's listserv is built through a very simple Google group. It's a great free option. And I would recommend picking a listserv option that provides a digest page And that way members can go there if they feel like they've missed part of a conversation. It actually stacks conversations in order of subject line. So for example, to prepare for this call, we went back through all of the conversations around COVID-19 on the NCN listserv, and we're able to find very quickly ideas from the field and questions that had come up versus trying to dig through your email to find those. Some membership and conference space management softwares, which NCN had a webinar just earlier this week, which already feels like eons ago, they have built-in messaging forums. Lots of them offer some sort of chat or messaging forum. So it's worth exploring that if you already have a software set up to manage your space, it's possible that there are Slack-like or listserv-like features already built in depending on what you're using. I wanted to share, call out one particular quote that came in through when we sent out questions to each of you to help us prepare for this. So thanks for those of you who got back to us around your most pressing questions. Staff from the Hive in Vancouver asked, how do you provide equivalent value to members when they can't access a space that they're paying for? We've created some online Zoom calls to connect, but they essentially paid for a burger, and now we're streaming a video of the burger and they're paying the same rate. How do you reconcile that? Super valid sentiment, and thanks for the chuckle. I totally hear you. One of the options of course you can't provide an exact equivalent, but you could consider providing free virtual workspace to your members in exchange for the workspace that they can't access. Ellen Ross from Federated Charities in Frederick, who's on the call, said that they offered to pay for video conferencing software through their own provider for their members. And Irene from Sketchpad in Chicago said that she also includes Zoom for all of their members. So one of the concepts is extending your membership to the folks that are part of your community so that they don't have that extra expense. Prior to moving to a full shelter in place here in San Francisco, so again, recognizing that right now across the country and in Canada, there's a range of shelter in place orders. So some folks have access to the building, some folks don't. At Tides, before that went into order, there were still executive directors of our tenant organizations that asked to host meetings in our conference rooms because their offices lacked the equipment and connectivity to host virtual meetings either easily or at all. Because our rooms are wired with Zoom rooms, we offered free training by all of our staff on using the conferencing equipment and software. That was a higher level of service than we would typically offer, but just considering sort of the stress that the executive directors were facing on having board meetings that were entirely virtual, we actually allowed our IT and facility staff to train folks that were interested in using the rooms because we thought that was that it was a higher level of service than we were used to providing, but it was really important as they were really struggling to take their operations virtual. I'd also recommend simply asking your members what would be of service to them as they move their work online. There were a couple of questions that came in through the pre-call questionnaire that folks said, like, we don't know what would provide them value at this point. Well, it might be worth asking. So many our tenants vary wildly from size, organizational budget, staffing structure, programs. Maybe they have ideas about how you could be still a value add. They probably still look to you as if you are a good resource, and maybe they suspect that you have more experience with things like Zoom or Slack, and so there's room for you then to ask them and then provide that kind of information. There was a question about file sharing software recommendations, so I'd be interested to know if folks on the call have anything to offer around that. Besides things like Box or Google Drive, but I'm not sure if any of you are offering things to your members in the way of file sharing software if you can't access local drives that are kept on site. The last piece I'll go into is maintaining some vibrancy in the community, and these are a little less technical things that people are doing to just keep their community kind of humming along and providing support around this immense amount of stress that all of us are handling right now. Burke at the Posner Center reported, and that's in Denver, reported that they've moved all programming to a remote option, and they're also ramping up virtual networking. They're calling it social quickening while physically distancing, which I thought was pretty great. Irene from Sketchpad says that twice a week their members meet on Zoom for 30 minutes. Each meeting has a different member presenter, and people have participated and appreciated the check-in and continuing the water cooler conversations online. Here at Tides, we've developed a long list of reasons for folks to hop on Zoom. We do happy hours and coffee chats a few times a week. We also did one specifically for new staff. You can imagine what it would be like to be onboarded onto one of your tenant organizations, your own organization, during this time, and it's happening. And so folks are, their first day is spent in isolation. And so I know that from Tides, we offer new hire tours around our campus that are always well attended. Tenants send volunteers and interns and board members, anyone who's new to the campus who might want a tour. And we're considering moving that online so that folks who have started in the last few weeks already feel like they have a sense of the community and just get to meet a few of us that help run the campus. We also have at Tides a team member who asks a new question over Slack every week about a wide range of topics, some deeply personal, like discussing your birth order and the impact it's had on your life, or books and music that have been influential to you. This usually created a really fun in-office chatter, but now we're moving to a virtual water cooler chat once a week to dive further into these questions. So if you have anyone who's really creative on your team, maybe task them with throwing out, fun personal things that take the focus a little off of work. I think that that's okay right now as we all weather this. And create creative conversations around that. And with that, I think that there's a way to recognize that in this kind of in virtual programming, that work is second or third down someone's list of priorities right now. If they are a parent or a caregiver, or like so many of us, some days managing the stress takes what feels like pretty full focus. And so I think that for your community, it doesn't have to, all of the virtual programming doesn't have to be what you might have considered in-person programming a few months ago. Maybe it's possible for you to integrate pastimes, children, pets into this kind of community programming. At Tides, we've hosted a Show Your Art virtual water cooler chat, knowing that lots of folks are doing art right now for stress relief and to pass the time. We have a Furs Day virtual water cooler chat where folks introduce their pets to their colleagues in the community. We have weekly mindfulness sessions, including one that was delivered for both parents and children to participate in that. And I also saw on Forbes that someone created the concept of a worry o'clock. It was introduced by a marketing firm in New York, where it's a weekly video chat where folks can log in and collectively wring their hands. The idea is to share issues in a supportive space designated for airing anxiety without fear of killing the vibe of other meetings. And so really creating a space where folks can, some of our tenants at Tides are really small, and they're 1 or 2 person organizations, and just thinking about the sort of the lack of social network that they have hopefully they have friends and family, but having that work community to say, it's okay that you're really freaked out right now. All of us are, because right now I find that a lot of the work meetings start with that anyway. And so maybe providing a space like that for your community could be really worthwhile. One last piece, the managing large Zoom calls, it can occasionally feel like a cacophony of folks speaking at the same time, interrupting each other, and then everyone stops talking because they're not sure which order they were. We've found, just as a best practice, that a daisy chain model works really well if you're hosting, where it sort of looks like Hollywood squares, and there's, you're seeing 24 faces. If you're trying to do some sort of round robin, ask that the person, you can kick it off, but then the next person who shares calls on the next person who shares, and then you kind of create this daisy chain. It feels a little less over facilitated, and because if you're facilitating, it can feel a little over formalized for a video call that's meant to feel more community oriented. So you can think of these sort of creative distributed leadership systems for large Zoom calls, so that they feel you know, a little less chaotic, but still allow that grassroots piece to come in. That's the end of my section around you know, keeping your vibrant virtual community. I am just gonna look through the chat real quick. Lena, I don't know if you caught anything while I was talking that we could.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was just going to make a comment too, like the wide variety of options that you guys have at different times probably makes each of these things less unruly, because people have different times that they can chime in. It's not everybody coming in for every event. But there was a request to share from Posner, a request to share our Zoom credentials because many members had the free version of Zoom maxes out at 40 minutes. And curious to know if anyone else has had to share the Zoom request and how are they managing that?
Can I just put a plug in through, if folks are not familiar with TechSoup, probably most are, that's a discount site. I'm going to put the link in here. TechSoup does have a discounted rate for Zoom. You can get 10 licenses for $190 for a year. So it's pretty deep discount off their regular. So maybe avoiding the share credentials piece and opening up if you can get the 10 licenses and share them with your tenant community. If it's within the guidelines, I don't know. Anyway, but that's a discount offering as well. And there are other items on TechSoup. If folks aren't familiar with TechSoup, I think most people are, but maybe pushing that out to your tenant community as well.
That's great. I'm seeing yeah, a lot of great recommendations in the chat. There was a question about, will we be addressing all of the questions that came in through the pre-call survey, and we're going to do our best. Each of us tried to integrate a few of the themes into what we ended up talking about, but we will do our best to grab any unanswered questions and again turn it into either more specialized content or maybe even on the Ask NCN listserv, we can get to them. If there are any questions that you feel that as a participant that you feel like haven't been addressed that you want addressed, we have about 7 more minutes. Now would be a great time to send that into the chat, and then Saul, David, myself, or Lena can address those while you have us on the line.
And I can launch the poll if we want to do that now to give people time.
Perfect.
Or, let's see here. So yeah, the poll is up for attendees. I don't know if the panelists, oh, looks we're getting some votes, so it should be working.
I see someone called out the digest version of listservs. I think that with any communication platform that leverages email, even if the listserv itself is managed, for example, through a Google group, it ultimately, when someone sends it out, lands in someone's inbox. I think we can all certainly relate to noisy listservs that feel like they come in so fast. If you have chosen to receive a response every time someone responds to a question, there's also digest options, which Google Groups allow the flexibility to do. So each member can decide how often they get notified that there is an additional post, and that prevents it. I mean, I know NCN, for example, the listserv some days is quite busy because there's robust conversation, especially around something like this. But the members are empowered to go in and select how often they want to be notified. And so if you are building a listserv, make sure that your members know that they have this option to throttle how many times they get pinged in their email, because some folks are pretty averse to, to things like noisy listservs that in an already chaotic inbox. One of the other things I would mention about listservs is then deciding who from your tenant's staff get to be on your listserv if you are the one who's going to decide that. At Tides, when I first joined a few years ago, we had an email list of main points of contact from tenants, and which worked relatively well. We would send out an email to our main points of contact if there was an upcoming event or a property management update. But what I found was that when I began talking to staff, especially of larger tenant organizations, they hadn't heard about what was being talked about. They didn't know that there was an event. They didn't know that the building was going to be closed. And especially with these more social pieces, it might be worth asking everyone from your tenant organization to be subscribed, so that if there is something going on like a happy hour, it's not up to your executive director, main point of contact, to send that out to their staff, especially in this very distributed workforce right now where folks aren't in the same office and can't mention something like that. I would ask you to consider how to get as many staff as possible from each tenant organization into these messaging platforms, so that they can also participate, especially around the emotional health and mental well-being right now. So what if the executive director forgets to mention that there's a Share Your Art happy hour going on, but some of the staff that are feeling really isolated it would really serve them to get the chance to participate. It's hard when you're not just bumping into people and you can't mention these things. So think about how full you can get your communication platforms from the staff.
And I'll just leave the poll open for another minute or so. So if you haven't voted, go ahead and do that. And I was just going to add in regards to listserv, one NCN kind of our best practice generally is to just keep one question out there at a time, because that generally allows those questions to be answered more fully, as opposed to posting 4 questions at once and it just all getting lost in there. And certainly there's a benefit to the Daily Digest version, especially if you are just someone who always gets swamped with email. I just recommend having someone in your organization maybe getting the regular pings, because then that obviously is going to promote you to participate as well. If you're just getting a Daily Digest, you might be kind of taken, but not always giving. So just finding that balance with a listserv.
Okay, we can, if anyone has any additional, I'm sorry, reading and talking at the same time. Anyone has anyone additional, Ezzy Dominguez asks if anyone is experiencing layoffs within your community. So feel free to add in if that, if you are seeing that and your experience with that. And then David and Saul, any additional pieces you'd mention with the remaining 2 minutes?
Is that coming up?
Yes, it is. No, just everybody, thank you for taking the time. And I think we'll look at prioritizing these next, at least the top 2 for upcoming webinars. Around, I think particularly the revenue and expense one, but there's lots more to talk about. So keep sending in questions so we can help figure out the key topic areas and other content experts that we might bring in.
And I'll just add that we will save the chat. So if you missed any links or recommendations, we'll get that to you, as well as the recording. We have a little kink to work out with getting the right computer that has the software editing. But so thank you for your patience on that, but we will get that out, especially for those who attended by phone and couldn't see the chat too. So you will see that in your inbox eventually.
Okay, I think that we are right on time. David, unless you have anything else to add?
No, just thank you all. And yeah, keep pinging us if there's a topic that you want covered, you know, and we'll keep an eye out for issues that are coming up on the listserv. I'll put a plug in for NCN if you're one of the non-members viewing today. You know, this is why we're here. It's a super lively community. The listserv alone is worth the price of admission. So you know, come back.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Be
Bye,
well.
all.
Guys.
Take care.